The evening air over Texas carried a warmth unfamiliar to men who had spent years under desert suns and battlefront dust. As the train slowed to a halt at a small-town station, German prisoners pressed their faces to the glass, expecting shadows and silence. What greeted them instead was a world ablaze with light. Every farmhouse window glowed. Street lamps lined the roads like endless sentinels. Shop fronts shone with such brightness that the prisoners blinked, convinced it was an illusion staged to impress them. For 3 years they had been told that America was weak, fractured, a society on the verge of collapse. Yet here, on an ordinary night, abundance radiated casually, as though the country had endless reserves of energy. In Germany, blackout orders had plunged entire cities into darkness since the early 40s. Even before the war, most villages had known only candles and kerosene lamps. Yet across the Texas plains, light flowed as freely as water, stretching into the horizon with no sign of scarcity. One prisoner gripped his seat, struggling to reconcile the sight with the image of America fed to him by propaganda. He thought of Berlin, shrouded in fear each night, windows covered, families huddled in silence. Here, children laughed openly under streetlight. Some strolled past stores without looking over their shoulders. There was no sense of deprivation, no hint of struggle, only the careless glow of a society unafraid of waste. In that moment, disbelief became heavier than defeat. These men had faced tanks, artillery and bombers without losing faith in their cause. Yet the simple sight of electricity in every window unsettled them more than any battlefield loss. The question whispered through the train cars was the same. If America could treat light as infinite, what else might it possess without end? The train pushed deeper into the night, carrying with it hundreds of German prisoners who could not stop staring at what they saw outside. To them, every glowing bulb was a contradiction. Every illuminated street a challenge to everything they had been taught. In their homeland, light was rationed like bread. Entire neighborhoods fell into silence after dusk, curtains drawn tight, families whispering in darkness while sirens wailed overhead. Candles and oil lamps became a way of life, their faint flicker a reminder of shortages and fear. Here, it was different. Town after town passed by the windows, each one alive with brightness. Neon signs hummed above diners still open near midnight. Gas stations glowed as if the war did not exist. Houses gleamed with more than one room lit at a time, a luxury few Germans had known even in peacetime. Children leaned on porches beneath the warm haze of electric bulbs, talking freely in the summer air. It was not staged, not propaganda, but the rhythm of everyday American life. The contrast cut deeply. Soldiers who had endured months of ration cards and cold apartments realized that these civilians far from the front lines lived in a comfort Germany could not provide its own people. Even the wealthiest districts of Hamburg or Munich could not rival the casual luxury seen in these ordinary small towns. To the prisoners it felt as though they were looking into another world, one where resources seemed endless, and the war was a distant rumor. Whispers passed from man to man in the dim train cars. If ordinary workers could live like this, if every household could leave lights burning without worry, what did it say about America's strength? For men taught to believe in German superiority, the simple glow of electricity raised a question more unsettling than defeat itself. Had they been fighting a phantom enemy all along? As the prisoners stepped down from the cars, they braced for the familiar sting of humiliation: cattle wagons, overcrowded boxcars, the harsh treatment they had known across Europe. Instead, their boots touched the platform after a journey spent in cushioned seats, dining cars and berths designed for travelers, not captives. The shock was silent at first, then rippled through them in uneasy glances. These were not transport wagons for livestock. These were passenger coaches fit for tourists. Inside, polished wood panels reflected the soft glow of lamps. Seats reclined into bunks where weary men could stretch instead of crouching shoulder to shoulder. Dining cars offered white bread, steaming coffee and hot meals served on real plates. Some guards even apologized for minor discomforts: an air conditioner that did not run properly, a meal that was late by a few minutes. The apologies themselves felt surreal. To men hardened by war, this was not captivity. It was disorienting comfort. For months, their rations had been dry crusts and thin stews. Now meals arrived with meat, vegetables and fruit, portions they had not seen since before the war. They sat in silence, chewing slowly, unable to decide if this generosity was real or a trick. Could an enemy feed prisoners better than their homeland fed its own civilians? Could soldiers captured in defeat eat more in one day than their families would see in a week? One young officer pressed his fingers into the bread, half expecting it to vanish like smoke. Another whispered that this must be propaganda too carefully designed to sway their thoughts. Yet no one could deny the taste on their tongues, the weight of full stomachs, the comfort of clean sheets on the train ride. In a single journey, the image of a crumbling, decadent America began to fracture, replaced by a quieter, more troubling truth. Perhaps abundance was their reality. The Atlantic air smelled of salt and oil as German prisoners lined the deck of a transport ship, their eyes fixed on the hulking vessel beside them. Painted in dull grey, massive in scale, it was not a warship bristling with guns, but something far more unsettling, a cargo ship called a Liberty. The guards spoke casually of its construction, as though discussing the weather. 4 days, they said, just over 4 days from the laying of the keel to its launch into the water. The prisoners laughed at first. Such a claim was absurd. In Germany, a ship of this size would take months, even years to complete. Every plank, every rivet, every seam demanded time and scarce resources. Yet the Americans insisted that this Liberty ship, the SS Robert E. Peary, had been built in 4 days, 15 hours and 29 minutes. The number alone defied imagination. As days passed, the truth pressed harder against disbelief. They learned that these ships were not rare miracles but routine products of an industrial rhythm Germany could not match. At the height of the war, American shipyards produced 3 Liberty ships every single day. Each vessel required 250,000 individual parts, manufactured in factories across 32 states, then assembled with a precision that seemed almost mechanical in its speed. Prisoners whispered among themselves as the figures stacked higher and higher. 2,710 Liberty ships were planned, and by the time most would be repatriated, nearly all would be complete. Each carried cargo that sustained Allied armies, and when the holds were empty, they carried men like them, tens of thousands of POWs across the ocean with the same efficiency. The realization was crushing. For every German submarine sinking one freighter, America could replace it in days. Scarcity had defined their war. Abundance defined America's, and abundance, they now understood, could not be defeated. When the train finally pulled into the Norfolk Naval Base, the prisoners pressed against the glass, unable to comprehend the sight before them. Docks stretched farther than the eye could see, lined with cargo ships in every stage of loading and unloading. Towering cranes swung overhead, lifting entire rail cars of supplies as if they weighed nothing. The rhythm was relentless, steel arms moving in perfect sequence, engines humming, freight flowing in steady streams. One man whispered that in Hamburg a single crane and a dozen laborers would take an entire day to load what these Americans moved in an hour. Here dozens of cranes moved side by side, each one operated with an ease that bordered on casual. The smell of oil and sea salt filled the air, mingling with the distant clang of metal on metal. It was not chaos, but choreography, a dance of machines and men across acres of waterfront. Factories stood in the distance, their chimneys sending faint smoke into the sky, their windows glowing even after sunset. Rail lines fed directly into the ports, trains arriving and departing every few minutes, each one burdened with coal, steel and grain. For the Germans accustomed to shortages and bottlenecks, the endless stream of resources felt surreal. Nothing stalled, nothing broke down. Every element moved as though part of one colossal machine. Prisoners pointed to the parking lots near the docks, filled not with military trucks but with rows of civilian automobiles. Ordinary laborers drove to work in their own cars, left them beside cranes taller than church spires, and returned home without marveling at what they had seen. To the captured men, this normalcy was the most staggering detail of all. It was more than a naval base, it was a living engine, proof that America's supply chains stretched without end. For the first time, many of them felt truly small, tiny figures standing before a power that seemed limitless, unshakable and impossibly vast. As the prisoners marched from the Norfolk docks toward waiting trains, their boots struck the pavement in unsteady rhythm. They were still absorbing the sight of cranes and endless cargo when their eyes fell on something far more intimate. Ordinary American workers leaving their shifts, men with grease on their sleeves, women with lunch pails in hand, teenagers laughing as they bicycled past lines of ships, and parked beside them were automobiles, rows of them gleaming under street lamps as casually as if they were bicycles. For German laborers, a car was a dream. Years of propaganda had promised the Volkswagen, but almost none had ever seen one outside of parade. In America, it seemed every dockworker owned a car, some even two, and they treated them not as rare treasures but as necessities. Workers climbed in, rolled down the windows and drove away without a second glance, leaving the prisoners staring in disbelief. Their envy sharpened when they saw what those same men carried. Bottles of Coca-Cola tossed into trash bins half full, cigarettes smoked halfway, then discarded without thought, leather boots scuffed from daily use, boots that would have cost a German laborer months of wage. Even the workers' lunches packed in tin boxes contained meat and fruit that had become rarities back home. One prisoner whispered that these dock workers, these ordinary men, lived better than most German officers. Another muttered that his father, who had labored decades in a Berlin factory, had never once owned shoes as fine as the ones casually worn by these laborers. The wealth was not flaunted, it was simply normal, and that normality was the most painful revelation of all. For men raised in scarcity, the casual abundance of American workers felt like another kind of power. It was not just factories or ships, it was the everyday comfort of ordinary people that revealed the true scale of America's strength. The first true jolt to the senses came not from factories or machines, but from something far more basic: food. On the long Atlantic crossing, German prisoners noticed the daily routine of the American sailor. At first it was the smell drifting from the mess hall: roasted meat, fresh bread and the bitter steam of real coffee. Then came the sight of plates scraped clean, not because they were empty but because half-eaten portions were simply discarded. To men who had survived on thin stews and black bread stretched with sawdust, the waste alone was enough to make them stare in silence. One prisoner later wrote that more food was thrown away in a single day aboard ship than his entire company had received in weekly rations during the last months in North Africa. Loaves of bread went stale and were tossed aside. Gallons of milk soured and were poured out without hesitation. Steaks with only a bite missing landed in garbage bins. It was not done with cruelty, it was done casually, as though the supply were limitless and the loss of a meal meant nothing at all. For German soldiers who had carefully counted every crumb, who had eaten watery soup from rusty tins, the abundance felt like a punch to the stomach. Here the enemy treated food as a common utility, not a treasure, and that realization was more powerful than any propaganda. When prisoners were finally given their own rations, the shock deepened. White bread soft to the touch, slabs of meat served twice a day, and coffee poured freely into metal cups. This was not a performance staged to impress them, it was the American standard. To men who had fought bravely for a homeland sinking into hunger, it was a revelation that gnawed at the very foundation of their beliefs. Snow had not yet reached Texas, but December carried its own kind of chill. Inside the prisoner camp, German soldiers prepared themselves for a silent, empty Christmas, expecting nothing more than rations and routine. Yet what unfolded astonished them. Packages began to arrive, hundreds of them, then thousands sent by churches, charities, and ordinary American families. Each box contained cigarettes, candy, toiletries, and sometimes small games or books. For men who had resigned themselves to absence, the arrival of these gifts felt almost impossible. On Christmas Eve, choirs from nearby towns entered the camp. The sound of familiar carols sung in German drifted across the barracks, voices of strangers offering comfort to men they had every reason to hate. Women from the community sent homemade cakes and cookies, wrapped carefully as though for their own son. Scouts delivered hand-drawn cards with messages of peace. The prisoners sat stunned, some clutching the cards to their chests, unable to believe such gestures could come from their enemies. The feast itself seemed like a dream. Tables filled with turkey, ham, mashed potatoes, vegetables, pies, even ice cream. German prisoners ate until they were full, some until they felt ill, laughing quietly through disbelief. One soldier later confessed that the meal was better than anything he had ever experienced, even at home before the war. It was not propaganda, the guards insisted. It was simply what every American family ate for Christmas. As the night closed, reflection replaced astonishment. How could a people locked in deadly war with them show such mercy? How could strangers sing to them in their own language, feed them as honored guests, and treat them not as monsters but as men? In that moment the barriers of ideology cracked. For the first time many prisoners understood that America's greatest strength was not just its machines or its food, but its humanity. For weeks the rhythm of American abundance pressed against the prisoners' pride, but it was the small everyday moments that finally broke their composure. Assigned to kitchen duties, some found themselves staring at piles of uneaten bread and meat thrown into bins because regulations required surplus, perfectly good food, discarded not with malice, but with indifference. One man admitted that he wept silently as he shoveled fresh loaves into the garbage, knowing his family back home rationed every crumb. It was not just waste. It was proof that America had so much it could afford to throw away what Germans dreamed of tasting. The collapse deepened when kindness reached them directly. Guards shared cigarettes without being asked. Farmers' wives brought lunches to prisoners working in fields, handing out sandwiches with thick slices of cheese and meat. Some even packed extra for men to take back to their barracks. The gestures were small, almost casual, but to those who had been raised on hatred, they felt unbearable. Letters smuggled through the Red Cross carried similar blows. One prisoner received word that his wife and children had been sent food packages by an American church group. The enemy was feeding his family while his own government struggled to provide. For hardened soldiers, this moral inversion was more difficult to endure than defeat in battle. Around campfires and in bunks, whispers grew into quiet confessions. "They treat us as men," one said, "not even as enemies, just men." Many avoided speaking further, fearful of what it meant to accept such thoughts. Yet the truth lingered in their eyes. Their captors' strength lay not only in factories or weapons, but in the security to show mercy, and that mercy dismantled beliefs more effectively than any bomb could. By the beginning of 1944, the camps had changed from places of confinement into something altogether unexpected. Thousands of German prisoners, men who had once marched under banners of conquest, now sat in wooden chairs with notebooks open, listening to American professors. What began as small lessons in English quickly grew into organized courses in mathematics, history, economics, and even physics. Universities across the country sent help. The University of Chicago provided correspondence programs. Stanford dispatched lecturers to Texas camps, their voices carrying through crowded halls filled with attentive prisoners. In some cases, entire barracks were converted into makeshift schools. Chalkboards replaced propaganda posters. Bookshelves stacked with donated volumes stood where bunks once lined the walls. For many of the prisoners, the exposure was disorienting. They had been told America was a land without culture, a mongrel nation incapable of serious thought. Yet here, professors, including Jewish refugees, who had fled the Reich, taught them with patience, clarity, and not a trace of bitterness. Science, they explained, belonged to no nation. Mathematics knew no borders. Ideas could not be conquered by army. A German physicist later wrote that he attended lectures on atomic research in Mississippi, stunned to discover that Americans were years ahead of anything Germany had attempted. The lessons were not cloaked in secrecy or arrogance. Instead, they were offered openly, as if knowledge itself was a kind of gift. Prisoners scribbled furiously, desperate to capture details, driven not by orders but by genuine curiosity. The effect was profound. For the first time, men who had been trained to see knowledge as power reserved for elites began to view education as something universal, something accessible. Respect replaced suspicion. Curiosity softened ideology. In classrooms built inside barbed wire, men discovered a different kind of strength, one rooted not in weapons but in wisdom. Evenings in the camps brought a different kind of lesson, one that no prisoner had anticipated. Instead of propaganda reels or carefully staged military triumphs, the Americans wheeled in projectors and screened Hollywood films. At first, the Germans expected stories of victory and glory meant to humiliate them. Instead, they were confronted with something far stranger: Americans criticizing themselves. The prisoners watched Gone with the Wind, a sweeping story of loss and recovery after civil war. Here was a nation unafraid to show defeat, hunger, and despair, yet also resilience. Another night brought The Grapes of Wrath, a tale of poverty and injustice during the Great Depression. The idea that a country would expose such weakness openly and in front of enemies was unthinkable to men raised in a culture where every flaw was hidden, every hardship denied. At first, many prisoners sat in stunned silence. Was this a trick? Could it be propaganda designed to confuse them? Yet the more they watched, the clearer the truth became. This was not deception, it was honesty. A society so confident in itself that it could admit mistakes and still stand strong. Whispers spread through the barracks after each screening. "They hide nothing," one man said quietly. "They show their problems, even to us." To the Germans this was both baffling and deeply impressive. In their homeland, a story like The Grapes of Wrath would have been destroyed, and its author silenced. Here it was celebrated, shown proudly even to prisoners of war. The effect was disarming. Respect replaced suspicion. The realization grew that strength was not just measured in tanks or ships, but in the ability to confront truth without fear. In the flickering light of those camp theaters, German prisoners saw a democracy that drew power not from silence, but from honesty, and that honesty began to unravel everything they thought they knew. For German prisoners who had grown up under years of Nazi propaganda, nothing was more disorienting than what they witnessed in American factories. At Higgins Industries in New Orleans, where landing craft were built for the coming invasion of Europe, they saw thousands of workers moving in seamless shifts around the clock. But what struck them most was not the speed of production, it was who was doing the work. Women in overalls and welding masks guided cranes across the floor, sparks flying as they cut and joined steel. Teenagers barely out of school stood confidently at drilling machines, their hands steady, their work precise. And perhaps most shocking of all, African American men and women worked openly beside white workers, operating heavy equipment, handling complex machinery, and supervising production lines. The prisoners exchanged uneasy glances. In Germany, propaganda had taught them that democracy was chaos, that minorities were incapable of skilled labor, and that women were too weak for industry. Yet here on the factory floor, those lies shattered. Women bent steel to their will. Black workers ran massive machines with expertise that no one dared question. Production did not falter. If anything, it thrived. One prisoner later wrote, "They told us such a society could never work, that it would collapse into disorder. Instead, we saw efficiency greater than anything in Germany." Another remembered watching a young black foreman give instructions to white workers who followed without hesitation. It was a sight so alien to Nazi ideology that some men could not speak of it for weeks. The contradiction was undeniable. A system built on supposed weakness had harnessed its diversity into unmatched strength. For soldiers who believed in racial hierarchy, this was not just a shock. It was an earthquake that cracked the very ground beneath their conviction. By the summer of 1944, the prisoners who had been watching America's factories and farms suddenly faced the ultimate proof of what all that production meant. News of the Normandy invasion reached the camps within days, carried on newspapers, radio reports, and finally on reels of film projected in mess halls. At first, many could not believe the numbers. 6,000 ships, they said, 11,000 aircraft, 150,000 men in the first wave alone. The figures felt unreal, like the exaggerations of propaganda. Then came the images. The prisoners watched grainy film of endless convoys stretching across the channel, each vessel heavy with soldiers and supplies. They saw landing craft swarming beaches like insects, waves of tanks and trucks rolling ashore without pause. Artificial harbors, built from concrete and steel, floated in place to create ports where none had existed the day before. Behind them, lines of ships stretched to the horizon. One German officer muttered under his breath, "It is not an army, it is an ocean." The air assault was no less staggering. Thousands of aircraft filled the skies, some towing gliders, others dropping paratroopers in clouds of silk. To men who had once believed German air power was supreme, the sheer volume of planes overhead seemed crushing. What broke many was not just the size of the invasion, but the organization. Supplies moved with flawless rhythm, 15,000 tons, unloaded daily across open beaches, cranes and trucks working as though the chaos of battle did not exist. For prisoners who had seen Germany struggle to maintain supply lines even within its own borders, the contrast was devastating. As the reels ended, silence filled the room. For the first time, no one argued, no one clung to denial. The truth was overwhelming. Nazi belief collapsed not with speeches, but with the sight of an enemy capable of moving the impossible. Not long after the shock of Normandy, the Americans delivered a different kind of revelation, one that struck deeper than ships or planes. In the spring of 1945, footage from the newly liberated concentration camps was shown inside the prisoner barracks. At first, the Germans refused to believe what they were seeing. Emaciated figures stumbling through barbed wire gates, piles of bodies stacked like firewood, Survivors staring blankly at the cameras with eyes that had seen too much. Whispers filled the room. "This is propaganda." Some turned their faces away, others clenched their fists, insisting it was impossible. Yet the evidence kept coming: film reels, photographs, testimony from American soldiers who had been there. Eventually, letters from families in Germany confirmed the horror. There was no escape from the truth. For men who had clung to some notion of German honor despite defeat, this was the breaking point. Pride curdled into shame. One officer who had once spoken proudly of serving the Reich now admitted that everything he had fought for had been poisoned from the start. Another wrote in his diary that he felt like a criminal simply for wearing the uniform. The realization spread slowly but relentlessly. Their cause had not only been lost, it had been evil. The Reich had promised civilization, order, and strength. Instead, it had built death factories. The Americans had not needed to invent stories or craft clever arguments. Reality itself had become the most powerful weapon. Some prisoners wept openly, others sat in stunned silence, unable to reconcile the nation they had loved with the crimes revealed before their eyes. For the first time, many admitted aloud that they had been fighting for criminals, and with that admission came a heavy, suffocating shame that no victory could have erased. By the time spring turned to summer in 1945, the German prisoners no longer measured defeat only in lost battles. The surrender of armies and the collapse of fronts had been crushing enough, but what followed in the camps forced a deeper reckoning. They realized they had not simply lost a war, they had lost the very moral foundation on which they had built their loyalty. The proof of America's strength had been undeniable: the factories, the farms, the fleets of ships and skies full of planes. Yet it was the evidence of Germany's crimes that tore through the last defenses of pride. The films of camps, the stories from liberated towns, the testimonies of survivors, all combined to expose a truth that could not be explained away. Defeat was no longer about territory or power, it was about identity, and that identity had crumbled. In letters and diaries, prisoners confessed to feelings they had never allowed themselves before. "We thought we were warriors," one wrote, "but we were only two." Another admitted that he had once believed courage and sacrifice could redeem any cause, but now he saw that bravery had been wasted on serving evil. The collapse was not loud or dramatic. It happened quietly, in conversations after lights out, in silence during mealtime, in the refusal to argue when statistics were shown. Where once men defended the Reich with fiery words, now they stared at the floor, unable to summon conviction. For many, the hardest truth was that their enemies, whom they had been told were weak and decadent, had treated them with dignity, while their own government had led them into dishonor. That reversal was more devastating than any battlefield defeat. It was the final collapse, the recognition that the Reich had destroyed itself from within. As the war drew to a close in May 1945, the German prisoners who had spent years behind American fences faced a new journey, returning to their broken homeland. They had arrived as soldiers, many still clinging to belief in a Reich that promised glory. Now they left with eyes opened, carrying lessons they had never expected to learn in captivity. For months before repatriation, American authorities prepared the men not with punishment, but with training. Vocational programs taught them modern farming methods, factory skills, and even the basics of democratic government. In classrooms filled with chalk dust and textbooks, discussions turned to what a post-war Germany might look like. Some prisoners practiced welding and carpentry, others studied crop rotation and mechanized harvesting, while officers debated constitutions and free markets. It was education disguised as preparation, and it left a lasting mark. When trains carried them to ports and ships ferried them back across the Atlantic, many prisoners reflected on the contrasts they had seen. They had witnessed machines that could harvest fields in a day, factories that could outproduce entire nations, and communities that treated even enemies with dignity. The lessons were not abstract, they were vivid, unforgettable images. Bread thrown away because there was too much, women welding steel without hesitation, children in small towns growing up with electric light in every room. Back in Germany, these men returned to ruins, cities flattened, families scattered, and a society stained by shame. Yet they carried with them something rare: knowledge that life could be different. They had seen how abundance could be built through freedom, how democracy could generate strength, and how mercy could heal wounds that weapons could not. The journey home was not just a return, it was the beginning of a quiet transfer of ideas, seeds planted in American soil, now carried back to reshape a defeated nation. The Germany that awaited returning prisoners was unrecognizable. Cities lay in ruins, factories reduced to twisted steel, and food was scarce. Families mourned losses too deep to count, and the nation's spirit was fractured. Yet into this bleak landscape stepped men who had seen something different during captivity. They had glimpsed how abundance was created, how order could grow from democracy, and how dignity could exist even in times of conflict. Many of these former POWs carried their American lessons directly into Reconstruction. Farmers who had labored in Texas fields now introduced mechanized methods back home, transforming yields in regions where hand tools once ruled. Former industrial workers who had toured American factories brought back knowledge of assembly lines, efficiency, and the importance of skilled labor. Even small practices, like maintaining surplus to guarantee stability, became part of rebuilding a starving nation. Some rose to positions of leadership. Ex-prisoners became local officials, educators, and business owners. They had learned not just practical skills but also a mindset that prosperity was built on cooperation, not domination. In villages across West Germany, men who once wore the uniform of the Reich now argued for democratic councils, rebuilt schools, and urged their neighbors to embrace ideas they had once resisted. The influence reached higher levels as well. Politicians who had spent time in American camps championed integration with the West, drawing on memories of American efficiency and humanity. Their experiences helped shape the foundation of what became West Germany's economic miracle in the 1990s. The Marshall Plan provided resources, but it was knowledge, much of it carried home by former prisoners, that allowed those resources to take root. The continuity was striking. The same men who had once stared in disbelief at overflowing cafeterias and endless convoys now worked to ensure their own communities would never face scarcity again. Their story proved that even in defeat, lessons could be learned that would outlast war and fuel a nation's rebirth. Decades after the war, the memories of captivity in America lingered not as scars, but as unexpected gifts. Former German prisoners returned to the United States, not in chains but as visitors, tourists, and even immigrants. In the summer of 1985, hundreds gathered in Texas for a reunion. Men who had once stepped off trains as enemies now embraced one another as old friends. Stories filled the halls that evening. One man remembered working on a farm in Iowa, where the family treated him like a distant cousin, sharing meals at the same table. Another spoke of the Christmas choir that had sung carols in German, an act of kindness that stayed with him long after the barbed wire was gone. Some told of writing letters to American families for decades, correspondence that outlived the war itself. There were tears, laughter, and long silences where memories spoke louder than words. Many brought their children and grandchildren, eager to show them the place where their transformation began. For the younger generations, it was hard to imagine that their fathers and grandfathers had once been enemies of the very people now welcoming them back. One former POW stood before the crowd and spoke words that captured the mood of the gathering. "We came as prisoners, and we left as students. We came believing lies, and we left having seen the truth. What changed us was not fear but humanity." The room erupted in applause, not just for the man but for the idea that even war could not extinguish decency. These reunions were more than nostalgia. They were proof that compassion had outlasted hatred. The men who once marched into America under guard returned years later by choice, carrying gratitude in their hearts. In their reflections lay the quiet truth that humanity itself had been the war's most enduring victory.